Hi, I'm Maia Conrado, and I'm a product manager for Wear OS. Today, we're going to talk to you about the new developer preview of Compose for Wear OS. Specifically, we'll walk through what's similar, what's different, and what's new in this version of Compose, so you can quickly develop your own beautiful apps with less code. There are many reasons why Compose for Wear OS will be helpful. The components are compliant with Material U guidelines out of the box, meaning you can more easily follow the design guidelines. Compose for Wear OS is currently in alpha and has released a number of updates since we teased it at I/O. We are now ready for a developer preview and want to incorporate your feedback into the early iterations of the libraries before the beta release. We expect you to have a little bit of knowledge about Compose as we go through this talk, but don't worry if you don't understand everything. We'll have resources at the end to help you learn at your own pace. But before we can dive into Compose itself, let's talk at a higher level about the differences between Wear OS and Android mobile development, for any of you not familiar with Wear OS. As a recap, we recently launched a new version of the platform with some major improvements to the Wear OS experience. But that didn't change the fact that the new version of Wear OS is based on Android, as before, and is optimized for the wrist. One of the benefits of Compose for Mobile is that it works across many versions and API levels of Android. Similarly, Compose for Wear OS will work on Wear OS 3, which is API level 30, but also on the Wear OS 2 watches out there. And just like mobile, Compose for Wear OS is part of the Jetpack library, and just like the other Wear Jetpack libraries you use, it helps you write better code. But let's look a little higher at some of the fundamentals of Wear OS app architecture. You may not realize it, but when you are developing for mobile, you are actually targeting more than one surface. First, the app surface, which in the old world has UI powered by fragments, activities, and views. In the new world of Compose, the UIs are powered by composables. So you know all that and are used to that. But you are also developing for another surface, notifications. And that's going to be when you want to alert your user of some important information outside of your app, or let them continue something they may have started in your app, like tracking a run or playing music. Finally, if you're using widgets, that's another surface where you can provide information to users. Wear OS is similarly comprised of multiple surfaces that you would want to target when creating a full-fledged Wear OS app experience. First is the overlay, which is basically just like the app on mobile, previously composed of activities, views, and fragments, but now by composables. It is well suited for longer or more complex interactions. Notifications also follow the same principles as mobile development. Then there are two new surfaces. Complications, which provide predictable, glanceable access to information directly from the watch face. When tapped, complications usually direct to the corresponding app experience. However, they can also perform a self-contained action, like a water count complication changing the number of glasses you've had during the day. Finally, tiles give users fast access to information and actions, with more space to display content. They are reachable by swiping in either direction from the watch face. But for this session, we are focusing on overlays, or the phone equivalent of an app, as this is where all of the views, or in this case composables, will live. Now on to the good stuff. We'll quickly demo a number of Wear composables to give you an idea of how they work and how they are similar to mobile before diving into more complex composables. But before we can cover any composables, we need to make sure we have the right dependencies. And the dependencies are going to be a little different from mobile Compose. Let's look at mobile first. On mobile, you have the main set of dependencies: Material, Foundation, UI, Runtime, Compiler, and optionally, you have Navigation and Animation. Well, what about Wear? First, let's talk about what's the same. On Wear, you can use the same UI Compose dependency as you would in mobile, and the Runtime, Compiler, and Animation dependencies are all the same. A lot of the other stuff is the same too, like the tools and the Compose philosophy, like data down, events up. Okay, so what's different? First, replace Material with Wear Compose Material. While it's technically possible to use the mobile material, it is not optimized for Wear and Wear's unique requirements. So we always recommend you replace it with the Wear equivalent. The other material dependencies outside of that can still be used. For example, you can use Material Ripple and Material Icons Extended. Next, include the Wear Foundation dependency. This one's additive, so you can use it with the mobile Foundation dependency if you want to. Finally, if you are using navigation, replace it with the Wear navigation equivalent, for the same reasons you would with material. It's optimized for the watch. Now, Jeremy's going to walk you through Wear material, where many of our new composables can be found.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Walker, and I'm a Developer Relations Engineer at Google. The Compose Wear OS material library offers many of the same composables you've grown used to on mobile, but optimized for the watch. And as with mobile, you can override the material theme and customize your colors, typographies, and shapes. Let's dive into our first Wear composable. All right, buttons are compact elements that allow users to take actions and make choices with a single tap. Here are a couple examples from the library. While these look different from the mobile equivalents, the code is actually the same. Let's have a look. First, you have the button, the composable, just like is before. Next, you have a bunch of parameters. You're used to the modifier. That's going to be on everything. You have on-click, same, enabled. In this case, I have enabled state. All right, let's say you want to add an app icon. So this is just the same as it was before on mobile. You just set a painter, content descriptor, and a modifier. So the code is exactly the same as you do on mobile. Let's see what the results look like. All right, so here you have a nice little button, and now you use the same code, but it's optimized for Wear OS. And with just a small amount of edits, you can really vastly change what it looks like as well. Here are some other examples. All right, let's jump into another one. Cards take content and actions about a single subject and have a lot of flexibility, as you can see from the examples here. On the left, we have an icon and some text. You can have just text, and then on the right, we have an image as the background. So we actually have two main cards. We have the app card, and then we have the title card, which is more focused on text, but we're just gonna focus on the app card. In this case, I'm just setting an image, then I'm gonna set some text. I'm just setting a text composable on all these in order. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see pretty straightforward. I have an on-click. Finally, I'm going to set the body. In this case, I'm setting a column and a text as well. I could add another text if I wanted to, but I'm just going to use one here. So again, this code is pretty similar. Let's have a look at what it looks like. So there's a nice card optimized for Wear OS. And same thing here, you can make some slight modifications and get different beautiful looking cards. All right, chips. Chips are actually specified in our material guidelines, but there isn't one in the mobile material library. They are meant for quick one-tap actions, which makes especially good sense for a Wear device and limited screen real estate. Here's a couple of variations of chips to give you an idea of what you can create, but let's look at some code. So the chip, it's pretty straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. The parameters, those are going to be similar. Again, these are stuff you usually set on other things. I'm going to just set a label. We have 1 minute yoga, which is about right for me. And then we're going to set an icon. So again, pretty straightforward stuff. And this is what it looks like. Again, with a little bit of variation, you can make all sorts of different chips. Okay, let's have a look at another one. So this is toggle chips. This is similar to chips, but it allows the user to use a radio button, a toggle, or a checkbox. So the idea, like on the left, you can disable the sound by just one tap and turn it back on. And then on the right, we actually have split toggle chips, which offers two different tappable areas. One on the right to turn off the thing, and then maybe on the left, it taps into the app. So you can maybe you want to edit your alarm here, but on the right, you turn it off. So let's look at some code. So again, toggle chip, pretty straightforward. You set some parameters. This is just going to be similar to what you're used to with the other composables I just showed. I'm just going to set a label for sound. This one will turn on and off sound. And let's see what that looks like. All right, so we have a nice sound toggle chip here to turn out the sound. And again, with a little bit of variation, you can have all these options. Okay, at this point, you're probably seeing a pattern. Many composables are the same as what you've already used on mobile. And the new ones, well, they're so familiar that they're almost the same. In other words, most of the work you've done to learn Compose, well, now you have it on Wear OS, which is great because Compose is fun, right? Okay, let's look at another one I really like. So curved text is optimized for the round screen because obviously it's important for a round device. Time text is another option which basically under the hood uses curved text, but takes care of all the time for you. So you do not have to mess with any time-related classes, which makes me super happy. Actually, our material guideline calls that you keep the time at the top of your screen within the app or overlay experience. And if you're actually using the Where's scaffold, then that takes care of it for you. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But let's have a look at it. So first, I'm going to actually create some text that I set before my time. So I do that first. Next, I create the time text composable. I want to specify the leading curved content. And what that means is this is the text that will show before the time, right? And because it's curved, this will only show for curved or round devices. In this case, I'm actually using under the hood a basic curved text. I set the time. Next, I do a linear content. So this will be for a square or rectangular device. I just want to use a regular text there, but I still want that to be in front. Now there's other options. You could put the text behind. You can add a separator if you want. I'm just keeping it simple and doing it on the front here. And this is what you get. You can see I have ETA, that's the text I created, and then the time. And the best part, I didn't have to mess with any time classes. And if this was on a square device, then it would show up nice on a square device as well. All right, let's talk about lists. So lists contain a continuous vertical set of elements, blah, blah, blah. You already know this. Everyone uses lists everywhere. But it's a little bit different on Wear OS. So on the top and the bottom of the screen, there's less space, right? So a material design introduced scaling and transparency with the new scaling lazy column. So this helps you view lists in a small space. So let's have a look at that. So this is an example to show exactly what I'm talking about. So you can see the element as it comes up, it gets bigger and becomes more opaque. And then as it goes away, it gets smaller and it kind of disappears a little bit. And that's what scaling lazy column does for you. Here's an actual app where you can actually see it. Same thing, kind of scales up and disappears. And then it scales down and disappears as well, which is really nice and helps with readability. All right, so scaling lazy column. It should be your default for any app on Wear OS. It obviously gives you the scaling and transparency effects I just talked about, but also it handles a large number of items. So you're probably guessing by the name scaling lazy column that it was built with lazy column, and you'd be right. You get all the advantages of lazy column, which for instance, when you have a long list like what we see on the screen there, you only can view a small portion of it. So lazy column is going to do all those optimizations and only compose what's needed on the screen at the time. So you get all that for free. And the nice scaling and transparency features. All right, let's look at some code. So you're used to setting state anyway for your lazy columns. Same thing here, except you use a different name. Remember scaling lazy list state. That's kind of a mouthful, but it explains exactly what it is pretty well. Next, you create a scaling lazy column, just like you would a lazy column, and you set your parameters. These are all the same, modifiers, vertical arrangement, and then you set the state. After that, you set the content, and this is exactly the same. Items are supported in item, so whatever you want to do here. And that'll give you something like this with no extra work, which is great. Okay, now we want to talk to something else you're probably familiar with, box. So as a reminder, a box is basically a container for your screen. You can use it on mobile, but we have our own, and it's called swipe to dismiss box. And this is going to be for your layout. So you're probably guessing from the name, swipe to dismiss. This means swipe to dismiss. Pretty straightforward. So on where actually one of the gestures, the main gestures is swiping, and that will go back as if it's the back button. So in this case, this is supported for you out of the box. So let's look at some code. So what's different from box on mobile is you actually have to have state. So you'll use a remember swipe to dismiss box state. You create the composable with swipe to dismiss box. In this case, you pass in the state. You'll get a Boolean back, which is background. And what that means is it's in the process of swiping away. So you can actually render different things based on that. So in our case, we'll render a different color just so you can see it. If you're using any sort of navigation, you probably want to show the screen that was before the current one that they're swiping back from. And in this case, I'm just setting a column with some text. I could add more, but we'll keep it simple. So this is what it looks like. And also there's a bunch of other options you can do. We have stuff with launched effect. You'll want to use that with navigation if you're doing your own under the hood. But check it out. I don't have time to go into that, but we'll cover it in the docs. Okay, we have two things left. We're going to talk about scaffold and navigation. Let's start with scaffold. So Scaffold, it's easy to make sure your components are properly positioned and work together correctly while following the basic material design layout structure. For instance, with mobile, it provides slots for the most common top-level material components. So like top bar, bottom bar, floating action button, all that stuff. In this case, if we look at this mobile app, you can see it has a bottom bar. If you had a drawer, you could swipe left and see a drawer menu if you wanted to. The Scaffold handles snack bars. It makes it a lot easier for you. And then obviously you'd have your content in there. And the idea is that some of that stuff is kind of above your screen. So as you change those out, that stuff stays more the same. Obviously you can customize it a little bit, but for the most part, it's staying the same. Well, we have the same idea with where, but we only have three main ones outside of the content. We have time text, which is pretty straightforward. You've already seen time text. That's going to give you your time at the top of the screen. It's going to place it for you, which is nice. Next, we have vignette, which gives you a nice vignette around the screen. It's kind of hard to see here, but you can imagine a nice vignette you get around the screen. And then finally, we have position indicator. This is also known as the scrolling indicator, which lets you know where you are in the composable below. So you're probably asking, why do we put this in the scaffold? Well, due to the curvature of the screen, the position indicator needs to be centered on the watch, not just centered on the viewport, because otherwise it could be cut off. Like for example here, you can see this is a playlist. That part does not move, but the scrollable portion below it does. So if we were to set that to the viewport, most of the scrolling indicator would be cut off. So that's why we've moved that up to the scaffold level. And then finally, we have content. All right, before we move forward, I'd like to just talk about the scaffold design first, because that's important. It took me a little while to get my head wrapped around it, but once I did it, then I always want to make sure that I ingrain this in people's heads. So the first thing you want to do is you set your app, you do your material theme like you're used to doing for the look and feel of your app. Then you put your scaffold, and then after that you put your content. So if you're doing this in mobile, it's the same thing, it's the same recommendation. It's just below the theme, above the content. All right, let's look at some code. So in our example, our content inside the scaffold is a scaling lazy column. So we hoist its state up here to support the position indicator. Let's look at that a little bit deeper. So because the position, as I've talked about a little bit earlier, lives outside the content, that means you have to hoist the state above the scaffold. Again, this is because we just don't want it cut off on all the other screens, especially if they don't take up all the sides. There's some other benefits as well. So you can check the scrolling state. So maybe you make the time disappear when they're scrolling to give more screen real estate, or you can even turn the vignette off and on based on that scrolling state. By the way, if you want to learn more about state, check out Manuel's talk, a composed state of mind. It's really great, and he'll explain a bunch of stuff about state and how it all works together, and he'll touch upon the scaffold stuff. Okay, so we've hoisted the state up for the position indicator. By the way, the position indicator supports many different options. So for scrolling, so in our case, we're using a scaling lazy list, but you could use a scaling lazy list state, but you could use a scrolling state, a lazy list state, and then we have some other cool stuff with rotating side buttons and rotating bezels. There's basically lots of options. So check out the docs. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on. Next, you do your material theme, and then you put your scaffold, and then your content would go inside. I won't spell that all out, but again, whatever you want to put is your screen. Let's look at the parameters. So you have your modifier, that's the same. Next, we have time text. So you're used to the time text on your that I showed earlier. It's the same thing, you just drop it right in there, so we don't have to cover that. Vignette, this one, well, let's break it out. It's actually pretty easy. You set the vignette position. In this case, we're doing top and bottom. And then finally, we'll set the position indicator. Let's pull that out and see what it looks like. In this case, I'm looking at the state to see if it's scrolling, so I don't show it unless it's scrolling. And then here's the most important part. The position indicator itself requires the state, and this is the main reason we hoisted that state up from that lazy column, so we pass that in. So there you go. When you're scrolling the content, you'll get a nice little scrolling bar, and you have the time on the top, and these will all stay visible when you're moving between your screens. Well, the scroll won't, obviously, but the time will, and if you have a vignette, that can as well. All right, So next and last, we'll get to navigation. All right, if you remember the earlier slide, you remember that I mentioned you have to replace the navigation dependency with the where navigation dependency. So I just want to call that again. Technically, you could still use the mobile one, but you're going to have a bad time, right? And the where navigation one is optimized for, well, obviously for where. All right, so it's the same design as I talked about earlier with the scaffold, and it's the same design as mobile. So you have your app, then you have your material theme, then your scaffold, and then normally in mobile, you'd put your nav host there. But in our case, because we're using the where equivalent, we use swipe dismissible nav host. And you can probably guess from the name that that means it supports swipe away, which is just like the box. And then you have your content. So it handles swiping, I just said that. And the nice thing is you'll see is you get to reuse your knowledge for mobile. All right, so let's look at some code. So the material theme and the scaffold, you set those just as you did before. Your navigation code will go here. In this case, we create a controller. We just use a specific one for the swipe dismissible version. So remember swipe dismissible nav controller, which is quite a mouthful, but it explains what it is pretty well. Then you use your swipe dismissible host. You pass in the controller to start destination with a route. And then you put your main screen content right here. And in this case, it's the same code that you used on mobile. Use Composable, and then you use it the same way to set your screens. And Magic, you'll have something like this, where you can swipe away, and it goes to the screen before. So you can set all this stuff up. All right, let's recap. So first, we're in developer preview now. We've had a lot of alpha releases, and we're ready for your feedback. Compose, make sure you set the right dependencies. You want to replace material, and you want to add foundation. And if you are using navigation, replace that as well. All that knowledge you've built up on Compose translates directly to where Compose, so you can build beautiful UIs fast. Just like the mobile alphas and the developer previews, we want to include your feedback. So make sure you give it to us, which leads us to the last slide, d.android.com/where/compose. That's where you'll find samples, code labs, guides, and most importantly, where to send us our feedback so we can incorporate it. I know your time is valuable, so thank you so much for spending some of it with us. Happy coding. Thank you.